Bruce Levine is a clinical psychologist living in Cincinnati, Ohio. He's the author of Common Sense Rebellion, as well as America's Depression Epidemic. He's a regular contributor to Z Magazine, Alternet, and the Huffington Post.
I'm Dr. Bruce Levine. I'm a clinical psychologist in Cincinnati, Ohio. Been in practice here for over 25 years. Written a few books. Last one is Surviving America's Depression Epidemic. Prior to that was a book called Common Sense Rebellion, Taking Back Your Lives from Drugs, Shrinks, Corporations, and a World Gone Crazy. Write regularly for Alternet Magazine, Z Magazine, Huffington Post, Ecologist. My clientele is, I work with adults and families and teenagers. Probably at any given time about a third teenagers. I work with folks who are, by and large, I would call them anti-authoritarian population, although my business would diagnose them with oppositional defiant disorder or attention deficit disorder or substance abuse. What I've found is a lot of the people who end up here and are comfortable with me that they are anti-authoritarians, usually without any kind of political consciousness. And often they are rebelling with self-destructive ways, and sometimes they're rebelling in a positive, life-affirming way, and they have no validation, they have no support. But for the most part, they're folks who are feeling utterly alienated by their surroundings, whether it's a school or it's a job or it's a society. And they've got a lot of pain off of that, and without validation of their pain and support, human beings tend to react and rebel often self-destructively. So they'll just drink 12 packs all day long with their pain rather than doing something that's actually going to transform their society or culture. It's just what all of us human beings do. When we get down low enough, we get down, when we're hurting enough, we don't really act sometimes in ways that are in our best self-interest. Psychology, to become a licensed clinical psychologist, PhD, you go through graduate training, and you do not have a medical degree, which is exactly why I wanted to have it. Because if you're a psychiatrist, it means you're an MD, you're a physician. And if you're a psychiatrist and you're an MD, it's the standard of care increasingly for almost everybody who's having some difficulty in life is to medicate them, to drug them with psychotropic drugs. Whereas if you're a PhD psychologist, you can't prescribe, except in a few states. Some psychologists have fought for prescription rights, but ordinarily there isn't that kind of a legal, peer, professional pressure if you're a PhD psychologist to medicate everyone, whereas if you are an MD psychiatrist, there is that pressure that you're actually doing something wrong because you're not putting some kid on speed, Ritalin, amphetamines, because the kid's not paying attention to school and he's paying attention to only things he's interested in. One of the things that I see, and this is not just me, it's historians of all genuine democratic movements, whether it was the American Revolution or more recently was the populist movement, which was big in Texas and lots of other parts of the United States. And in that populist movement and in the American Revolution, you see that there were two things that people had, which they don't have so much today, psychologically. One was individual self-respect. And the second thing that you need for a democratic mass movement is collective confidence or trust in one another. And when you're living in a kind of society that breaks people's self-respect and breaks their bonds of trust with one another, it makes it much more difficult to have any kind of a democratic revolutionary movement. There's a lot of different aspects to our society and our culture that has made us feel broken or demoralized or defeated. I'll give you one example. What any psychologists should know are the famous learned helplessness experiments that a lot of them were done on dogs. So one of the most famous learned helplessness experiment was you had 3 groups of dogs. One group of dogs received no electroshock, a control group. The other 2 groups received equal amounts of electroshock. But the difference was in one group, these dogs had control over being able to stop their electroshock. And the other group, they had no control. They learned helplessness. No matter what they did, their shocks. They could not stop their shocks. They moved into passivity, into depression. And then when all these dogs were given tasks where they could just jump over a barrier to escape from their electric shock, very simple task, the ones who had learned helplessness, the ones who had learned that no matter what they do, the shocks do not go away, they did not even try to jump over the barrier. Whereas the dogs that had learned that if they used their nose to press the panel and the shocks went away, they figured out how to jump over the barrier and escape. Well, think about what people get to do every election day, national elections, presidential elections. They get to choose a Republican. They get to vote for a Republican and basically vote for unnecessary wars and corporate control. Or they get to vote for a Democrat, and they vote for unnecessary wars and corporate control. Or they vote for a third-party candidate, maybe a Libertarian, maybe a Green Party, and the way it's set up is those third parties have no chance. The media makes sure they have no chance. So when they vote for those third parties, they still get a Democrat or Republican and corporate control and unnecessary wars. Or there's a fourth choice that people can make. They can choose not to vote at all, which is what a lot of people in America do. 40 to 50% in presidential elections don't bother voting. In off-year elections, it's a huge majority. People don't bother voting. So what do they get by not voting? Corporate control and unnecessary wars. And so that's learned helplessness. No matter what you do, as long as you're taking seriously that electoral processes, you're going to be helpless. You're going to get that same degree of pain. And so that's one way that people have become helpless and hopeless. They feel that there's nothing that they could do to focus on the electoral process as a way of changing, and no matter what they do, it creates just pain for them. They can't make it go away. So that's one arena. Another area and I ask myself, why is it this generation more passive than the last generation? Why is it that, for example, you had an election in 2000 where, regardless of the fact that how you feel about Al Gore, regardless of the fact that you think the guy was not much different than George W. Bush, regardless of that fact, this guy who had 51 million votes, roughly, 500,000 more than George W. Bush. They were going to have a recount in Florida, to see if he actually won that state. The politicized Supreme Court comes in, stops that recount. 51 million Al Gore voters are totally screwed. They're disenfranchised. What's happened? Are the streets filled with people protesting? There's a handful here, there's 100 here, maybe 1,000 here in front of the Supreme Court. Compare that to Mexico in 2006. They also had a similar kind of election where a slightly more progressive guy got screwed out of election by a slightly more conservative guy. You had almost 3 million people on the streets. In Iran, 2009, okay, same deal. Again, those people are facing a death if they get out there on the streets. Literally, people died and got arrested and had lives ruined. You had anywhere by estimates 1 million to 3 million people out of the streets in Iran. What is it about the United States, okay, that when people get disenfranchised in their elections, that they are more helpless, more hopeless, they just give up? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and one of them, it seems clear to me in this generation, is the issue of a broken population of people on student loans. One big difference in years back when I was growing up in America here, if you were rich, you went to these wealthy institutions. If you were working class, you go to public institutions. They were free. When you walked out when you were in your 20s, which is the time in life where you're most likely to rebel and protest and demonstrate, you walk out, maybe you have no job, you have nothing to lose, but you're not worried about being saddled with a $25,000, $50,000, $100,000 debt, which is what young people are saddled with in our society. Average debt, average just for undergraduates, is over $20,000. Any kind of professional training, it moves closer to $100,000 a year. Well, let me tell you, if I walked out, okay, when I was in my 20s with that kind of debt, it would have broken me. I wouldn't have resisted. I wouldn't have rebelled. I just would have went along with the program, been terrified of not having a job, been terrified of everything being taken away from me. And so we've done two things in our culture. We've pushed shame parents to make them feel like they're horrible parents if all their kids not only don't go to school, they don't go to prestigious school, they don't go get masters, they don't get their professional training. We've got a president who's shaming, whole society because they're not graduating from college. And then on the other hand, we have allowed these young people to lose all their grants, all their support, or low tuition, and have them pay these ridiculous rates in student loans, and debt breaks people. Okay, it's one of the ways that people have historically known that you will get broken when you're in debt. And so that's one way that they're broken. Historically, there's other ways that you break a population too. And I would say that there's three major ways that young people have been broken for many years in our society. One is television, two is schools, not necessarily in this order, and the third is my profession, the mental health profession. If you take a look at your average young person and their 24-hour school day, if you get rid of their 6 to 9 hours in bed and their couple of hours of eating meals and personal hygiene, what are they doing in that day? What's their socialization? Well, 7 hours of school, 1 or 2 hours of homework, all right? And then the rest of their day is filled with television and video games. I mean, that's the major socializing forces in their lives. All right? So what does that teach them? What's going on for them? Well, there's a lot of horrible things that happen in school. One is kids lose their interest in reading, which is great for an authoritarian society. We have research that shows that the difference between kids who are in first grade versus when they move up to third and fourth grade is they're less likely to want to read books independently. So school, naturally, by forcing kids to read things that they're not really interested in and a whole bunch of other things, like that, school actually makes it less likely people really are critical thinkers, curious, interested in reading, all those kinds of things. Overall, there's always exceptional teachers, but in general, that's what happens. Kids internalize the idea that the only way that you get an education is through some authority granting it to you, some authority's lectures, some authority's degrees, which is the opposite of the way people really get educated. Real education is through your own curiosity, through your peers. So school is an authoritarian-based pacifier in many ways. Then you move to the whole video game television area, especially television. Nowadays, kids on average are spending 4 or 5 hours a day in front of a television. They can watch it many different ways now. Besides just watching on a television set, there's alternative mediums to be able to watch it on their laptop, on their phone. So they're watching as much and more as ever TV. What are they learning there? Well, besides they're seeing shows, the vast majority of their programming is on stations that are owned by 6 corporations in America. The News Corp, Murdochs, and Viacom, and all these. Besides the content, they're learning something even worse. They're learning through these things that the only way that you get entertained is through some authority. All right? And they're learning that in their video games as well. Now, the video games are not quite as pacifying as at least that they're doing it with their friends. They're not in that kind of total zombie brainwave state that they are watching television. But either way, they're learning that the way you entertain yourself is through some authority. Here you got television and you got schools, both teaching kids that your education and your entertainment is via some authority, not through yourselves. For years, kids knew that you entertain yourself. After school, you'd go out and play with your friends, and you'd figure out stuff to have some fun. You didn't need any authority to entertain you. The third area that not all kids are exposed to, but the kids who are most rebellious, they get exposed to my business, the mental health profession. And here in my profession, increasingly, the pacifying force is medication, right? Any kid who has got oppositional defiant disorder, which you get by often arguing with adults and often refusing to comply with adults, those are the official symptoms. You get treated with behavior modification manipulations or medication, or any kid with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which means they're not paying attention to some teacher because they're boring, but they are willing to pay attention to things that are interesting for them, or if they're getting paid for it. These research shows that. That's most of these kids who are diagnosed with ADHD can pay attention to things that they are actually interested in. They just rebel against things that they're not interested in. And what our society, parents, children, media, accept the authority of these mental health professionals